2026 Leon Panetta Lecture Series. The 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. What will be its legacy in the 21st century? This lecture discusses the legacy of American foreign policy, world leadership alliances and democracy, or power, tariffs, and territory. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see you and to have you here this evening. Thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to welcome you to the Leon Panetta Lecture Series, coming to you from Leon's hometown of Monterey and the beautiful Monterey Conference Center. We're grateful, as ever, that this community sees the importance of these discussions. At a time when the majority of political discourse is divisive, it is a relief to be able to participate in respectful and balanced conversations on the challenges we face as Americans. This year, we're considering the legacy of the American Revolution and how the founding of our nation reflects on the challenges that we face today. America's role in the world has been evolving since the earliest days of the Republic, with President Washington famously discussing alliances in his farewell address. We've come a long way in protecting our national security, fighting 2 world wars, standing up to communism, bringing down the Berlin Wall, and now confronting an axis of aggression from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. This evening, we'll discuss the legacy of American foreign policy, world leadership, alliances and democracy, or power, tariffs, and territory. For 80 years since World War II, presidents, both Republican and Democrat, have supported the same principles when it comes to foreign policy. Strong U.S. world leadership, diplomacy that supports alliances, military readiness, democratic values, and the courage to stand up to tyrants. The Trump administration has moved away from many of the past principles of American foreign policy. The president has challenged free trade policies with high tariffs, criticized our allies for failing to support the war in Iran, threatened to take over Greenland, Canada, and Mexico, and removed one tyrant in Venezuela, but so far has failed to remove another tyrant regime in Iran. Some say foreign policy is chaotic and unpredictable. Others believe it is a new approach to America first. What will be the legacy of American foreign policy? Can we return to being a trusted ally in the fight to protect and promote democracy? What are the options for a resolution to the conflict in Iran? What will be the future of the American empire as a global leader? Leon will discuss these topics and questions with a distinguished panel of experts on national security, defense, and diplomacy. Now, our first guest became the 27th Secretary of Defense in July 2019, when he was confirmed 90-8 by the United States Senate. As Secretary, he made major strides in shaping and implementing the National Defense Strategy that called for a return to preparing for high-intensity conflict in a new era of great power competition. He established the Space Force and Space Command, proposed a dramatic change in the size and composition of the U.S. Navy, and enhanced the resourcing and operations of Cyber Command. He worked to strengthen alliances, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, and helped drive a major increase in the readiness of NATO members, all while advancing new war-fighting, operational, and readiness concepts in the U.S. military. During his time at the Pentagon, he managed crises including conflict with Iran, the military campaign in Afghanistan, counter-terrorist operations in the Middle East, open competition with China and Russia, all amidst a fundamental shift in the weapons and character of war and the spread of a global pandemic. So please welcome Dr. Mark Esper. Our second guest served as the 21st U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and was the first woman to serve in that position. In her long career, she has been a diplomat, a businesswoman, a professor, a political strategist, an author, a broadcast analyst, and a social worker. She has served under 3 presidents and 5 secretaries of state, becoming known as the diplomat for, quote, hard conversations in hard places, unquote. As Deputy Secretary, she was the point person on China. As Undersecretary for Political Affairs, she led the United States negotiating team that reached an agreement on the Iran nuclear deal. As counselor at the State Department, she was lead on North Korea and was engaged in Middle East negotiations. President Barack Obama awarded her the National Security Medal for her diplomatic accomplishments. She is a frequent commentator on television and radio and is the author of Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. So please welcome Ambassador Wendy Sherman. Our final guest served as the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security from December 2013 to January 2017. Prior to becoming Secretary of Homeland Security, he was appointed by President Obama to be General Counsel of the Department of Defense and appointed by President Clinton to be General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force. Earlier in his career, he was an Assistant United States Attorney for the District of New York. Earlier in his career, yes, he was an Assistant United States Attorney in Southern District of New York. In December 2018, he was presented with the Ronald Reagan Peace Through Strength Award at the Reagan Presidential Library for contributing greatly to the defense of our nation and, quote, guiding us through turbulent times with courage and wisdom, unquote. He now practices law in New York City at Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, LLP, and is also a regular commentator on NBC, CBS, ABC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, Fox Business, and Bloomberg News. Please welcome Secretary Jay Johnson. And of course, moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former United States representative for this district and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He is also a former White House Chief of Staff, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and Director of the Office for Civil Rights. During his time as Secretary of Defense, he helped bring 2 wars to a close, and as Director of the CIA, led the operation that brought Osama bin Laden to justice. He has a lot of wisdom to share about this perilous time in U.S. foreign policy. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this, our third forum of the 2026 Panetta Lecture Series. Our overall theme, as has been stated, is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. What will be its legacy in the 21st century? We've looked at our legacy throughout history in the first forum. We've also looked at the legacy of our economy. And tonight we focus on something particularly relevant to present events in the world, the legacy of American foreign policy. Well, George Washington argued in his farewell address that the U.S. should not become entangled with foreign countries and should remain neutral, a policy that worked obviously in the early years of our country. The fact is, it became pretty clear, particularly in the 20th century, that foreign adversaries, enemies, could threaten our national security. We learned the importance of world leadership. We learned the importance of building alliances, of having a strong military, of having strong diplomacy, of defending our democratic values, and of standing up to tyrants. The president talked about a new approach with America first and staying out of foreign wars. But he also came to realize that we cannot isolate the United States from those who threaten our democracy. And so we are again a nation at war. What will it take to finally end this war in Iran? Will we stand up to tyrants in Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran? What is our foreign policy in a dangerous world? How do we protect our homeland? Important questions at an important time. We'll discuss all of these concerns with our very distinguished panel of experts who have served this country. All of them have served this country with distinction and can present to you really their own firsthand knowledge of the challenge of protecting our national security. Let me begin with the question about our foreign policy. I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of moving parts in the president's foreign policy. He's talked about America first, talked about isolationism, talked about going it alone, talked a great deal about it being based on gut instinct. We've now seen him use military intervention successfully in Venezuela, and it remains to be seen what happens in Iran. We've got a touch of imperialism with efforts to control Greenland, Canada, Mexico, and some have called it all transactional nationalism, or basically the art of the deal. So what I'd like you to do is to give me your definition of American foreign policy in 2026, and how is it working? We'll start with you, Mark.
Okay. The token Republican gets the easy question.
Exactly.
Well, look, so having served in the first term, because I want to draw a contrast here, you know, what I thought was important then and was right at the moment and had not been done before is we had defined in the national security strategy and eventually in the national defense strategy a foreign policy based around this notion of a great power competition, and that, at least in terms of adversaries, our number one was China. And I made that central to everything I did. Now, of course, Russia was up there as well, and then you had the second tier with the North Koreas and Irans. And then you had, of course, all others plus terrorism. So to me, that was a solid approach to foreign policy that was not inconsistent with the previous, 6 decades coming out of World War II, much more engaged in the world. This one here, where we are now in Trump 2, is obviously more ill-defined, at least at this point. Folks, critics initially said, you know, it's about isolationism, but I think it's fair to say we haven't seen isolationism. And others would say, it's not a proper word, but restrainerism, and I don't think that's the case either. But so what I do see is I think the president is looking at hotspots around the world and trying to figure out, you know, what makes sense for the United States in the ways he sees it. Now, I believe in America first in the sense that presidents and lawmakers and everybody should put our country first, but it's how you go about doing that. So I'm a big believer in alliances and partnerships, and the way we help keep the nation secure is through alliances and partnerships. The way we help keep ourselves prosperous is through great trade relationships. So it's the lens through which you see it. So at this point in time, it's hard for me to draw a conclusion or to put a stamp on it to say what it is, because when it comes to trade, obviously we've taken actions across the table, not just with regard to bad trading partners or countries who were imposing things on us that were unequal, but also in terms of friends and others who weren't. So it's unclear there. In the strategic space, I think it's still the same, because I still define the world in terms of adversaries as China #1 and then Russia. And the president has defined that differently. Clearly in the national security strategy, he has said the Western Hemisphere, second only to Homeland Defense, is the priority, and that is a big shift. Now, I think you and I and others would agree that I should have spent more time on Latin America during my tenure, but it's a matter of how do you spend precious resources of time and people and materiel and attention, focus. He's decided that Latin America. So look, I think it's still ill-defined, and I think what the outcome is here with regard to Iran will put another marker on the table with regard to how we look at the Trump presidency through a foreign policy lens.
Yeah, good point.
First of all, good to be with you all, and great to be part of the Panetta Institute. Extraordinary work by both Secretary Panetta and Sylvia Panetta, and so thank you very much for doing this for all of us. And you'd be surprised, or maybe not, I'm sitting here, I'm an avowed Democrat. All my work has been in politically confirmed Senate positions, and yet I pretty much agree with much of what Mark has just said. And I think I know. I think that kind of partnership and that working together in the best interests of our country has sort of been forgotten in many ways. We see tremendous divisions in our Congress, and inability to really remember you're there to legislate on behalf of the American people. We see a court that's divided. We see our public that is divided. And a president who clearly, if you read back on all that President Trump has talked about for much of his life, he's always been for tariffs. He's always been for spheres of influence, in essence, where different parts of the world get carved up and somebody's got responsibility for them, but the United States doesn't have responsibility for everything. He is someone who believes that at the end of the day, he knows what needs to get done. And I don't think that he thinks that expertise is necessarily the beginning and end of things, and of course it's not. Politics and fingertips and sensibilities matter. What the American public cares about matters, but leadership matters. And for me, the greatest challenge for the United States is our relationship with China. The young people that we spoke with earlier today are going to live in a world that I simply can't comprehend and won't be around for most of it anyway. But it's a world of AI and quantum and biotech with lots of positive things, but an enormous number of challenges. And I think that the president, when he goes to China this coming week, has to talk about these issues. I hope he does, about technology, about where we are. He's taking a whole bunch of business people. And the last point, I would make two last points, sorry. He believes in business. He's a businessman. He understands that culture. I don't know that he really understands the culture of diplomacy. I'm not sure he understands that negotiation in an international sphere is about give and take. It's never about capitulation. It's never about getting your adversary to just lie down and die for you. It doesn't happen that way. And although I completely agree with the president, we have the most extraordinary military, soon to have stern competition from China, but not yet. We have an extraordinary economy, again, challenged by China, but not quite yet. And we have been strong politically, but right now, our politics, our democracy is being challenged. And the responsibility of each one of us is to do whatever we can to keep faith with that democracy, because at the end of the day, American foreign policy shouldn't be about our exquisite military, what used to be our great diplomacy, our great economy. It's about our great democracy and our values.
Jay?
Good evening, everybody. This is my first visit to Monterey, California. We were having lunch earlier upstairs, and Leon, who I served as his general counsel when he was Secretary of DOD and I was general counsel of DOD, great client to have, a lot of fun, for reasons that many of you probably know better than me. And he pointed out where his family restaurant was, where his parents' restaurant was down the street. And I asked him, so what was the staple meal at this great Italian restaurant, expecting to hear something like veal saltimbocca or say spaghetti and meatballs. Simple as that. But anyway, I thank you for including me in this discussion. We started off talking about the 250th anniversary of our independence. We like to talk about the Founding Fathers, capital F, capital F. It is true that 250 years ago we declared our independence, but frankly, simultaneously, the Founding Fathers disenfranchised more than half of us. Women, slaves, and of course the Native Americans who were already living here. And it wasn't for another century or more that all of us were enfranchised. But the Founding Fathers did create this system of checks and balances, co-equal branches of government that work well so long as the participants in each branch stand up for and assert their institutional prerogatives. In other words, do their jobs and obey their oath. If one branch of government decides to lay down politically to the other branch, then the system fails. Article 1, Section 8, as Leon knows, as a former member of Congress, Article 1, Section 8 gives to the Congress the prerogative, the authority to declare war. That provision is a near nullity. We have not declared war since 1941. Congress has not authorized the use of military force since 2002. And the president of both parties now have engaged the military in hostilities in a number of different contexts without the authorization of Congress. This president has taken it to a new level. Iran is a war, no doubt about it, it's a war. In the beginning, the Trump administration didn't want to use the word war because they knew they'd be trampling on the War Powers Resolution of 1973. But think about it. If another nation bombed our nation's capital, took out the US government leadership, I think we would call it a war, an act of war. So we have a system where the executive has started a war, and we seem to have to relearn the lessons of the past over and over again. It's much easier to start a war than it is to end one. And in this particular circumstance, there seem to be shifting justifications for why we got into this in the first place. When it comes to the war we're engaged in now, I'm convinced that the high point was the rescue operation of the 2 Air Force pilots. That was the U.S. military at its best. Now, I think even this president realizes he needs to find an exit ramp out of this thing that he started. It was highly predictable that the Iranians would use the Strait of Hormuz as their leverage, the result of which is that all of you here on the West Coast are paying more than $6 a gallon at the pump. And I believe that our standing in the world has the beacon of hope and freedom is suffering as a result. When we talk about foreign policy, I think it's important to realize, and Wendy touched on this, this president is fundamentally a businessman. He grew up in the business world in New York. He grew up in the real estate world in New York. And that's how he sees the world. He sees foreign policy as a business transaction, as a business negotiation. Somebody once joked to me, and I think it's so true, President Trump's style of negotiating is to threaten airstrikes and then settle for 60 cents on the dollar. That's how he negotiates. And that's not how you conduct diplomacy. That's not how you conduct foreign policy. As Wendy knows, you have to understand the culture of the people across the table from you. Don't assume that Iranians think like New Yorkers do. Don't assume that Israelis think like we do. Don't assume that South Africans or Iraqis think like we do, or even Pakistanis think like we do. You have to understand the culture, which is why it's so important to have foreign policy professionals at the table, and this administration does not. What I'd say about foreign policy, American foreign policy right now, it's more than just guns. It's more than just war fighting. It's our culture, it's our global, being a leader in our global economy, being a leader when it comes to higher education. I'm chairman of the board of trustees of Columbia University. 40% of Columbia University are international students. We still draw to this country young people who want to be educated here. And I think we should all be proud of that. We're still a leader globally when it comes to the economy. And when it comes to the business of government, I believe we're in a bad spot, but this too will pass.
Okay, let's talk about what's important in foreign policy about alliances. President Truman, George Marshall established NATO to stop the Iron Curtain from expanding in Europe, and NATO's largely proved itself in the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The president at one point threatened to leave NATO, although it would require an act of Congress, and I don't think that's likely. I think Congress would not want to leave NATO at this point. But he's also been critical of our allies for not supporting the U.S. and Iran, although he did not consult with them or seek their help in the attack. How important are alliances to U.S. security, and how badly have those relationships been damaged?
Look, I think alliances and partnerships are extremely critical to American security and to global stability, whether it's a multilateral alliance like NATO in Europe, where I served, as you know, for 3 years as a young Army officer, or the bilateral ones we have in the Indo-Pacific. So, look, I cut this up a lot of different ways. I never supported the president's language with regard to walking away from NATO and getting out of the alliance, but he was spot on with regard to the allies not paying enough, not contributing enough for the collective security. And I said earlier, that is a theme by American presidents since Eisenhower, and it was President Obama in 2012, 2014, that I think it was the Wells statement that said 2% GDP. And when I came into office, which was 7 years after that, still only 6 countries out of 27 were meeting the 2% commitment. So look, having served there, I love the alliance, it's been great. We've been carrying the weight for too long. And I think it's unfair to ask the American people to continue paying taxes so that we can sustain a 3.2% defense budget where the Europeans are paying 2%, maybe in most cases less than 2. So look, I think a series of things that have happened, to include him coming back in, the president pushing again, they're now committed to a higher level of defense spending. That's important. Now, fast forward to Iran. You're right. Expecting expecting the allies to jump in with regard to Iran after not being consulted beforehand would we understand why they're upset. It would have been highly unlikely they would do that just by the nature of their governments. On the other hand, frankly, I was offended, disappointed, certainly, for countries like Spain and Italy not allowing U.S. aircraft to base in those countries. We weren't asking them to go to war with us in Iran. We weren't asking to put anybody in harm. We were just asking to use our bases supported by our service members. I just thought that was a stupid call. I thought they should have thought more about what that means. I think they all recognize what a threat Iran is, not just to the Middle East, but to the broader global community as well, particularly Europe, if they get ballistic missiles. And I just thought it was a bad move by them. Now look, that's water under the bridge at this point. I think we all need to recognize we are where we are, and how do we move forward? We being now this collection of Western democracies, particularly those in the region and just outside the region, the Europeans in this case, that have capabilities that we could use in the Gulf, re-engage them and see what we can do to move forward to get this to a positive outcome at this point in time.
Wendy, let me take it a step further. Could there be an effort by our allies to basically help with the Straits of Hormuz? I mean, it seems to me that there is some room there to try to work out some kind of international approach to keeping the Straits open.
So the UK and France have organized a coalition of 40 countries to help with demining and keeping the strait open, but in their view, once it gets opened. So not to open it, but to make sure that it stays safe for freedom of navigation after the fact. Now, I understand the president's disappointment, but if you don't have somebody there at the takeoff, it's hard to ask them to come in and rescue you once you've taken them down a road that's, our gas prices have increased, and certainly here in California, they've increased enormously. But it's nothing compared to what people are facing in Asia, people are facing in India, people are facing in the Philippines. It is quite astonishing because they have no storage capacity. So the cost of gasoline is out of sight. And in terms of agriculture, the cost of fertilizer is out of sight, along with magnets and helium and lots of other commodities that come through the Strait of Hormuz. Do I think it's possible, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here, for the president to say, I'll lift the blockade, you open the Strait of Hormuz, let's use this international coalition to ensure the safety and security. We all have chatted about this, as you can imagine, since we've been here. Iran, Oman, UAE, since you all are on the margins of the strait, you can make sure there's safety, security. Is there some creative way to do this? Perhaps. But it is multilateral. It cannot be done just by us unless the president wants to send in the American military, which he certainly could do, but there would be a lot of lives lost. And the cost, we are talking so little about the cost of this war. It's probably, you guys know better than I do, at least $1 billion, $2 billion a day for this. And the deterioration of our weapon stocks is no secret to anybody anymore. And the president's about to go off to China, where we need to go in as strong as we possibly can. And I'm not ecstatic about the fact that the president's going there. I believe he should. We need that relationship. We need to confront China. But he's not going in the strongest position possible. And that puts him at a disadvantage in these negotiations. One other point I want to make, since you started this about NATO, I agree NATO countries should pay their fair share. each of those countries has domestic politics just like we do. And the reason we saw what we saw in Spain and Italy in terms of Iran and not allowing the bases is their domestic politics made that very hard for those leaders. They thought their leadership and their positions would be at risk. And that's a judgment each leader of a country has to make, even when we disagree with it. But yes, I think NATO should do more. Each country should do more. But I would remind everybody in the audience and everybody listening to this that the only time that NATO has ever invoked Article 5, the article that says an attack on one is an attack on all, the only time was for the United States of America, when NATO countries went into Afghanistan to help us. And every one of those countries who went in, pretty much every one, lost soldiers in the fight for us.
So, Jay,
If I could just say one thing.
Sure.
I don't disagree with you, and I know you want to stir it up a little bit.
it's all right.
Look, when I was in office, you were probably the same way. I'd hear this all the time, too. You don't understand our politics. You don't. Look, I do understand your politics. We have politics here in the United States.
Sure.
I'd prefer not to pay 3.5% of our GDP if we didn't have to. There's other priorities that, as a defense secretary, I'd like to put in money into, like we talk soft power. So look, I don't think we can let them get away with that reasoning.
I agree.
No, I know you're not saying it, but just for the audience, to say it's our domestic politics, you don't understand, we may lose power. Well, look, you may lose power. That's leadership. Leadership is about making a commitment, in this case to NATO, the alliance, the defense of the Western democracies in Europe. And in this case, I actually think Iran threatens all of that. And so set aside your domestic politics and lead. And otherwise, what you're doing, despite how it all happened and transpired, and I agree, they should have been consulted, we are where we are. Get off your butts. Let's all work together and find a way to solve this problem right now that has become globalized, because I think globalizing may offer a path forward to get out of it.
Jay, you were consul at the Pentagon Department of Defense. You were also Secretary of Homeland Security. Give me a sense of the relationship with allies and how important that was or wasn't to our own security.
Yeah, I did not expect when I took the job at DHS that I'd spend so much time in diplomacy, but I did. I met my counterparts in at least 20 different countries, and there were a number of times where we'd get a tip or a piece of information from the Ministry of Interior or from the intelligence community in a foreign country. So-and-so bad guy is planning to come to the United States. We just got this information. And they would either be interdicted before they could leave the country, or they were interdicted in some other third country on their way to the United States. And were it not for the alliance we had formed in information sharing, that person would have gotten into the United States. And so even in homeland security, counterterrorism, domestic counterterrorism, law enforcement, maintaining relationships, alliances with our foreign counterparts is key. It's part and parcel of the job.
Let me turn to the war in Iran. Obviously, a lot of mixed messages as to the objective of the war. But it began when we attacked with Israel. The president made clear that it was about regime change. Everybody anticipated that if you kill the leadership, that within a few days, the regime would come down and you'd have regime change occurring. That didn't happen. Our defense people, our intelligence people basically said it ain't going to happen. So now we move on because we did not achieve that objective. There are other objectives, stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, the effort to try to stop their missile and drone development, the issue now, of course, of opening the straits. We did achieve our military objectives, 15,000 targets were hit, and that certainly did weaken Iran. Netanyahu on 60 Minutes last night said the war is not over. and basically identified many of these objectives that are still remain to be achieved, including regime change, by the way. Trump says the war is over, that we've moved away from the war chapter, and now we've kind of moved into a different chapter. I think Rubio basically used that same example. And he wants to end the war. He wants to find a way to end the war. There's been negotiations. One could question how these negotiations are going. Kind of sending one-page summaries doesn't strike me as a very viable way to get to a deal, but that's what they're doing, and they're working through Pakistan. And God knows what the hell that means.
Diplomatic term of art.
So the issue then becomes when we got an offer back, the president basically said it's unacceptable. He's threatened the possibility of additional military action. What is the real objective of this war, and how is it going to end? How is it going to end, or is it going to end? Is it going to become another forever war in the Middle East? What do you think?
Well, I want to say before we answer that question, since we all talked about NATO, not all the NATO allies are the same. Some are better than others. So pro tip for all of you out there, if you ever get stopped on the street and somebody asks you, is this NATO ally a good one or a bad one? The first question you should ask is, how close are they to Russia? Because usually that tells you how good of an ally they are. Fear is quite motivating. Look, you're right. Look, the goals have moved around a good deal. The U.S. military has been very successful in accomplishing its military objectives, but that's different than the strategic objective or objectives. Look, I think at this point, I go back to where it all began. Witkoff and Kushner walked away from Geneva, the table at Geneva, because they said the Iranians aren't being serious with regard to the nuclear issue. And the president, to his credit, has been consistent with regard to the nuclear matter. So my view going into the conflict when asked this question was that we should at least get out of this conflict, a return to the negotiating table where they have agreed to a few things. One is getting rid of all the highly enriched uranium, or the 60%, which there's about 970 pounds worth. By the way, getting rid of the other enriched uranium, which is about 10 plus tons worth. I think a degradation or destruction of their nuclear facilities. I think you need to get and you need to get the inspectors back in, beginning with declarations and everything else so that we can monitor their agreement. To me, that would have been a successful conclusion of a first round of conflict. At this point, though, clearly, it has to be return of the Strait of Hormuz to the status quo ante, because that is a much more significant matter at this point in time. I mean, we're concerned about Iran gaining the nuclear option. It appears they've had it all along, and it's called the Strait of Hormuz, because now they're using it against us. And so at this point in time, whatever approach the president takes, and I know we want to discuss it, I said earlier it comes down to three things. There's a military option here that says you go in hard with regard to the seizing control of the western edge of Tehran right along the Strait of Hormuz, to seize that, to regain control of the strait. Number two is you walk away and you claim victory, which would be viewed as a defeat. Or number three, you continue on with economic strangulation with both sides, closing up the strait, and we see who blinks first. And the challenge with that, of course, is that will take months to kind of play out, and the question is whose economies will suffer first. So three options. I think at the end of the day, to me, the success I will look at are those two things: the status of the nuclear piece of it and who controls the Strait of Hormuz.
Wendy?
I think when the president made the decision to go forward with this adventure, this excursion, this skirmish, whatever you want to call it, this war, he didn't really understand Iran. And as Jay explicated, understanding the culture, the history, most most of us, and I certainly didn't understand this before I got deeply into this some years ago, in 1953, the United States and the United Kingdom, our intelligence communities, decided to knock off the legitimate prime minister of Iran, Mossadegh, because he was going to nationalize, we thought, the oil industry. It all comes down to oil, folks. We didn't want it nationalized, so we knocked him off. And we put in the Shah of Iran, who was good for us, but was terrible for the Iranian people. A real dictator and an oppressor. And while the Shah was here getting medical attention in the United States, in 1979, the revolution happened, American hostages were taken, and the rest is history. But what I think is hard for all of us to understand, because Iran is a horrible regime. They are the largest state sponsor of terrorism. They have been pursuing getting enough enriched material to have at least the option to get a nuclear weapon, even if the previous supreme leader had a fatwa saying they would never get a nuclear weapon. Nonetheless, they wanted to get to the place where they could have the option to have a nuclear weapon. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So, yes, they were terrible, but they thought we were pretty awful too, because we had made their lives miserable. That does not excuse what they've done. The president was right when he said the slaughter of the protesters should stop. The slaughter of the protesters was horrific. It should be stopped, but there's sort of like now a footnote. No one is really thinking about the Iranian people. Thousands have died since this war began. Their economy is horrible, but this is a country that in an Iran-Iraq war went on for 8 years in the Iran-Iraq war. They have staying power. They are willing to take pain that is extraordinary. They're taking extraordinary pain now, and because of the assassinations of the top leadership, maybe the second tier as well, as the president likes to say, the regime in Iran now is more hardline than it has ever been. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which we all talk about, is now, I believe, in complete control. They'd always had a lot of control.
And their standing among the public has gone up.
And their standing among the public has gone up because whenever you attack a country, the country's sense of national pride, particularly when you say you're going to destroy their civilization, well, they may hate the regime, but they're proud of being an Iranian. So we are in a very tough place. The president is in a very tough place. I think that Mark has laid out the options. I hope the president doesn't go in all guns blazing, because I don't think it will change Iran's mind. I do wish we had serious negotiations and serious negotiators. I'm sure Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are great businessmen. They seem to both be doing quite well economically. So I think they're great businessmen, but that does not make them great diplomatic negotiators, nor are there experts at the table.
Right.
I could go on this stop.
Anybody with a sense of history would recognize on day one, on February 28th, when he said, all right, I'm going to decapitate the leadership. Iranian people, over to you to take back your country. I'm your great liberator. You know, we have this, every once in a while, we stumble on this imperialistic impulse of ours to believe that a country of 93 million people are going to do what we say because we're America. And it was inevitable that if you take out that country's leadership, the people in the streets are going to rally around the next government. This was not regime change. It was just a change of personnel at the top. And I'm sure the popular will now against the so-called Great Satan is as hardened as it has ever been. It's had the reverse effect of what this president envisioned, which makes me worry exactly who's advising him? You know, in his first term, he had people like Mark Esper, Jim Mattis, John Kelly, Don McGahn, his White House counsel, who would, you know, Mark won't say it this way, but I will kind of, you know, walk him back from some of his more extreme impulses, and got frustrated, and then systematically drove them out. And now in Trump too, where are the guardrails? Who are the guardrails in this administration? I suspect that there are none at all. And that is what, to me, represents the greatest danger to our democracy.
Okay, let me,
If I could just 30 seconds. I just want to add a little nuance here. Look, I kind of share your view with regard to where we are now, but I saw what happened at the end of February as a strategic opportunity to kind of get the Iranians to try and get serious at the negotiating table. And I think we said it's gone too far. We kind of pushed them into a corner and brought ourselves with them. But I actually didn't see any issue with taking some type of limited strikes to go after them, to kind of continue to break down their air defenses, to take out some of their ballistic missile capabilities, so they could not rebuild a system that would make it really hard to deal with it, because we have to figure out a way to take down, to deal with their nuclear ambitions. And clearly the Trump was trying diplomacy to his credit. Like I said, I think what it was an accumulation of things going on for so long that pushed us to the point where they pulled the button. They said, we have nothing else left, let's shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and kind of put us into this situation. So I guess history academics and others will look back at this and study it, but I think there's, again, an attempt to get them to the negotiating table. There's a defensible argument that to take military action to do that made some sense.
But Mark, if I could just respectfully disagree. If I'm trying to get the United States of America to the negotiating table, I don't kill our leaders. I don't blow up the World Trade Center and say, okay, now come to the bargaining table. That's not how a nation is going to respond.
Yeah, but I think a counter argument would be, look, if there is also the chance if you take out the leadership, the regime collapses.
So I think the intelligence community would have told you, and I'll bet the intelligence community did say this.
yeah, they said it was farcical.
That it was farcical. Thank you. And I agree with you, Mark, that, and you've heard me say this today, any serious negotiation that can be successful in this kind of a situation does have to have a credible threat of force behind it. Mm-hmm. When we did the negotiations in 2011 to 2015, we had a credible threat of force. The Iranians knew that the President Obama had commissioned the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, which was ultimately used by President Trump, that could go and get the underground facility. So I agree, a military threat of force is an essential element of this kind of successful negotiation. But the kind of strikes that were taken, particularly when Witkoff and Kushner had met for like a day or two of discussions, and as those discussions were going on, in 2 instances, we attacked. And so you begin to think, why would I sit down and negotiate if what's going to happen to me is I'm going to get attacked? And these kind of negotiations, as Leon, you were saying, are so complex that it can't be done in a one-page. You can get top lines in a one-page MOU. It's not a deal, it's not an agreement, it's a memorandum of understanding that creates a framework for negotiations. I could see getting there, but it's very hard to do through a third-party mediator. It's very hard to do in the way this is being done by telephone.
But what you're talking about is kind of a, not post-conflict, but a post-agreement detailed negotiations, which I completely agree with you with. I think, and look, I wasn't there, so I can't say definitively. What Witkoff and Kushner said they came up with was the Iranians just simply were not serious in terms of any of the discussions about even getting to a framework agreement.
The thing about the Iranians, they are exceedingly difficult negotiators.
Yeah, so the question is...
Exceedingly difficult, and you can't just give up after a couple of days.
No, I hear you, but what I'm
Not
saying,
possible.
none of us were in that room, but the question is, and we'll find out someday,
Right.
is what were the Iranians doing while that was happening? Were they rebuilding their air defenses? And I believe that to be the case without knowing. We know them, probably.
Probably.
And so the question is, how long do you wait, right? And I'm going to be the first to agree with you all that I would have approached the allies and partners and talked to the Arab capitals and done all those types of things. But nonetheless, I'm just saying there's a credible argument to be made that they weren't serious, and that the way to make sure they understand your seriousness is to be willing to impose some pain upon them. Not what we've seen now, not where we are now, but nonetheless some pain to get them back to the negotiating table to start talking about real concessions that both sides could live with.
Okay, we've had a good exchange here. Let me break into this. I'd
Simple
like to
matter.
take a moment, if I can, to recognize the question review team, the people who are responsible for selecting the questions for the second half of the show. And if I'd ask you to hold your applause until I introduce them. Mike Clancy, our KSQD FM 90.7 guy. David Kellogg, the managing editor of the Monterey Herald. Doug McKnight, who's a reporter from KZU Radio. And Pete Waversky, who is the managing editor of the opinion page of the San Francisco Chronicle. We also want to give them a hand, would you? And at this point, as always, Sylvia and I want to thank the Panetta Institute Board of Directors, the lecture series sponsors that make these programs possible and allow us not only to have these important discussions, but to be able to present them to our audience watching at home and with the students from across Central and Northern California. We had a great student program on this afternoon. So if you would please give our board and the SPAN sponsors a hand, too. Okay, in light of Trump's upcoming trip to China, in what ways is China seeking to gain geopolitical advantage and world leadership in the wake of the war in Iran?
In what ways are they not?
Better question.
Yeah, and add to that, I mean, should the president be going? He's in, the war's still going on in Iran. He's clearly in a weak position in terms of the American people right now. He's also lost the power to implement tariffs because of the Supreme Court. Is this the best time for him to go to China?
Yeah, I know we talked about this earlier. I know when he presented one view. I would just say I think China is the greatest strategic threat we face this century. And so I think it's always a good thing to talk to the greatest strategic threat you face this century. There have not been really talks between the United States and China in the 15 months or so that Trump has been in power. And China continues to gain in any number of ways with regard to building their military, building in the tech space, stealing our tech. We have a big issue brewing with regard to AI development, AI safety that needs to be addressed. Obviously, it's the world's second largest economy and the world's greatest export powerhouse in the world. 130 countries have China as their top trading partner. They have a lot of diplomatic muscle, and they have plans and a strategy to build a first-class military by 2035 and dominate the Pacific, if not the globe, by 2049. So yeah, look, I think that we need constant engagement with the Chinese. I think it should be preceded by constant engagement with our allies, particularly at this point in time. I hope the president stops in Japan and meets with the new Prime Minister Takaichi, who has said all the right things with regard to building Japan's defenses and the defense of Taiwan. And I think it's going to be a tough negotiation, but I think we have to do it. There's never an easy time in the world, right? Every president faces challenges, whether or not it's of his or her own making. And so I think we have to engage the Chinese. And I think as long as we get an outcome that looks positive from our side of things, which in my mind means not conceding anything on Taiwan and getting some agreement on AI and on trade matters, and I think that would make for a successful outcome.
What do you think?
I'm all for the president going. I think it's quite critical because there is no doubt that China is the only country that has the wherewithal to be a real military, political, diplomatic, and economic competitor to the United States. There is no other country that has that capability at this point in history. And so China has things we need. We've had discussions during the day about all the critical minerals that they hold on to. We all remember from COVID when all the supply chains were interrupted and we began to realize we better figure out where things are in the world and have resilience, either make things ourselves here in this country or have trusted partners from whom we can get things, develop our own critical minerals capabilities. This is what Greenland was really all about, was the critical minerals in Greenland. This is what the Democratic Republic of Congo is about. It's getting cobalt out of the DRC. So Australia now has offered perhaps some possible outlets in terms of critical minerals. So there's a lot that we have to do to deal with China. I agree. I hope the president gives up absolutely nothing on Taiwan. I think he'll probably get something on fentanyl, on precursor chemicals, because that's something the Chinese have been willing to do in the past. The president saw Xi 6 months ago in South Korea. They seem to have a positive discussion. I think the president would love to have the power that Xi seems to have in his own country.
Every president would.
Yes, I'm sure.
Really?
I'm sure. The one thing I will say is Xi does have enormous control. He has recently gutted his defense leadership. There are different views about the gutting of that defense leadership. Some people believe these were corrupt guys not doing what he wants. Some people believe he wanted more loyal folks. Some people believe it has diminished their ability to meet the goals that they've set out. We will see, but there is no doubt. One more point on this. In the 90s, we all thought we were starting a new world with China. We all thought we could get along, we could be co-leaders in the world, everything would be groovy. I remember President Clinton standing with the president of China and even talking about human rights at a press conference. We thought, oh my God, we're in a new world. Well, we were wrong. Xi Jinping decided that China could win. And that is what he wants to do. Yep. He wants to win. He wants to beat the United States. And both Democrats and Republicans found that this was an area they could agree on Capitol Hill and everywhere else, that we had to be tougher where China was concerned. I hope we continue to believe that.
Leon, if I could.
Go ahead, Jay.
Well, Wendy, you're the professional diplomat here. I always thought that when the leaders of the two most powerful nations on earth got together, it was the culmination of a lot of diplomacy that preceded it, and they were showing up to sign the agreement or to sign the treaty.
That's the way it used to work.
That's the way it used to work, right. And I worry that with this president, who does not stick to scripts, and Xi in the powerful position he's in, our president may give away too much, may be taken advantage of.
One thing I will say is Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is going to Japan and South Korea before the president gets to China, which says to me there are some business deals that have been cooked. And whether that is allowing the Chinese to invest in the United States in ways that will make me personally pretty nervous, and the president's now taking with him, 10, 12 big CEOs of American companies. Mm-hmm. So something's cooking. We'll see. We'll soon see what that is.
This is to Jay. You're Secretary of Homeland Security. If the war in Iran continues, how much of a threat is it to our homeland security that we could face an attack by Iran?
I am concerned, and I've said this publicly several times now since this whole thing started. I'm concerned that we're in a heightened threat environment here in the homeland. Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, and there are terrorist-directed attacks where an organization will direct a large-scale attack on our homeland, like 9/11, like the attempted underwear bomber, the attempted shoe bomber, a large-scale attack on an aircraft or something. And then there are terrorist-inspired attacks where an individual lying in wait could be inspired by an organization or a state sponsor of terrorism overseas. And I'm concerned that we're in a heightened threat environment with that kind of threat in mind. Unfortunately, my old department seems to have withdrawn from the space of informing the American people of the type of threat that we may face. On my watch, we went to a system called NTAS, National Threat Advisory System. We got away from the color-coded bars, because once you ratchet up to a certain threat level, it's very difficult to ratchet down. And so we would issue these periodic bulletins to the public that would advise the public of the threat environment, what the government's doing about it, and what the public can do about it. And, you know, as everybody knows, large parts of DHS were not funded for a period of time, and we've seemed to have drawn from that space. It's an important space to occupy in a situation like the one we're in now. So I do worry that the risk is greater than it was 2 months ago.
Has Ukraine turned the tide in the war with Russia? Mark?
I don't think they've turned the tide. I think in the last few months, they have at least stabilized the front. There are places where the Ukrainians have actually gained a little bit of ground, but I think, you know, strategically it remains at a stalemate. The question, 6 months ago, I would have said that time is on Russia's side. I would say it with less confidence today. I think the Ukrainians have shown a lot of resilience and, more importantly, and a lot of courage, and then, importantly, a lot of innovation. So what they're doing today with regard to use of drones and counter-drone tactics and autonomous systems is historical. They are writing the book on things that we should be writing the book on, and we are far behind them. Yeah. So it's a credit to them. I've said a problem with the Defense Department has been, for years now, just a lack of sense of urgency with regard to what we face. And when you're a country under threat, not under threat, but under siege, you find ways to really succeed. And so importantly, I don't know how many people caught it, but for the first time in the history of warfare, we had just a few weeks ago, humans surrender to robots. So the Ukrainians sent in a combination of ground robots and air robots into, I forget the name of the town, maybe Pokrovsk, and there was a Russian infantry unit there that surrendered to the robots. And so this is what the Ukrainians are doing.
It's the war of the future.
It is a war of the future, but look, Ukraine has a manpower problem, and so when you lack manpower, you have to find other ways to come about that, and we are slow to do that. And we've been talking about Iran. Iran is a classic case of asymmetrical warfare, where a lesser capable country uses other means by which they can hold off, beat back, however you want to judge the state of the war with Iran, to a bigger country. And that's clearly what Ukraine is doing to Russia right now, is they're finding innovative ways, both in this case, both materially through autonomous systems and tactically, to beat back a more capable adversary. So I think it's incredible what's going on.
Okay. Wendy, does the war with Iran make it less likely or more likely that Iran will pursue nuclear weapons in the long term? Good question.
Sadly, more likely. I mean, I think that Iran has found first that the Strait of Hormuz is a deterrent, that they can pull that lever whenever they need to. We have always known that, by the way. I am sure someone told, whether he heard it or not, I am sure someone told the president that they would do this with the Strait of Hormuz, that they would attack other Gulf states, because all of us have gamed this out in previous administrations. So this is not a surprise. So I think we're just in a tough spot.
Oddly enough, it's actually a more useful weapon than a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
to be able to turn.
Yes, and I'd say on the nuclear weapon, because this is a more, sorry, I had a senior synapse lapse. I think the nuclear is much more likely now because it is a much more hardline regime. They probably believe, unlike the previous supreme leader, that they have to have a nuclear weapon, that North Korea is the example. And the current new supreme leader of Iran, Mushtaba, was the son of the previous supreme leader, and the previous supreme leader, who was assassinated, did not want his son to become supreme leader because he thought he was too rigid and too tied to the IRGC, or at least that is my understanding. I don't know for sure, obviously. And so I think it is more likely than not that they will now go for one.
Let me ask you, the problem we have is that obviously it's difficult to trust Iran because of the hardline regime. And I'm sure they don't trust President Trump very much. For 80 years in the Middle East, we've seen war take place every few years. Israel goes after, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, they defeat them, and then within a few years, they're back at war. If a deal is cut here that does the nuclear or opens up the straits, and it's the end of the war and we bring our forces back home, how likely is it that within another 4 or 5 years, the United States and Israel will be back at war?
Go ahead.
Well, it depends on the outcome of today, but I would say we also can't think one-dimensionally. If you look, you got to put yourself in Israel's shoes, right? Because what the problem they face. The reason why Israel wants regime change so bad, and in many ways we all want regime change too, is not just because of the nuclear issue, but because of the other issues with the terrorist proxy groups throughout the region. So, look, we could resolve the current issue with Iran through diplomacy, whatever we come up with. But even with the JCPOA, it doesn't solve the issue of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. It doesn't solve the problem of Hamas in Gaza. It doesn't solve the Shia militia groups or the Houthis. It doesn't solve any of those problems that remain threats to the state of Israel, threats to our partners, and empower the Iranian regime. And so in that context, then yes, we will be at least supporting Israel going back every few years to deal with that. Because keep in mind, this all began October 7th, 2023, when Hamas left Gaza, crossed into Israel, and murdered men, women, children, babies in their beds in many cases. And that's what kicked this whole thing off and what has pushed the situation to where we are today. And so is a repeat of all that possible? Yes, except that the Israelis have vowed never again, once again.
You asked earlier if this was a forever war. For the Israelis, it is, whether it's against the Iranian state or against their proxy groups.
Speaking of Israel, polls show that Israel has lost support with the American people over Gaza and is blamed for getting the U.S. into the war with Iran. Should there be limits to U.S. aid to Israel? What should be the relationship between the United States and Israel?
So I believe, as we've heard from both Mark and Jay, that much of what has happened is existential for Israel going back to October 7th and certainly before then. There are forces that have never wanted Israel to exist, and there is no doubt that Iran has always said that one of their objectives is to wipe Israel off the face of the map. So that's all very real. I think what is so hard right now is that the current Prime Minister and government of Israel have taken a very all-or-nothing stance, and in my view have not taken into account the need to really ensure that not only Israel can live in safety and security and peace, but that Palestinians have a life of dignity and peace and a state they can call their own. Jay talks about the growing terrorist threat. If you kill thousands of people in Gaza, I can assure you there is a next generation of young people who hate Israel even more than their parents did, because all of their family is now dead. And so you've created a next generation of terrorists. You haven't necessarily made Israel safer for all time, unless you want to keep mowing the lawn, which is in fact what has happened historically, is to just keep mowing the lawn, as it's called, but at such a human cost that it breaks my heart. And as I've said, you know, I came of political age, as some of the others here did, during the Vietnam War. And my generation at that time said to people my age now, you're wrong about Vietnam, we should get the hell out of there. Well, I listen to younger people now, I try to be around them as much as I can, and they think what has happened in the Middle East is wrong. And even the Prime Minister of Israel said on 60 Minutes the other night, it might take a decade, but it is time for American financing of Israel's military to end. And I think he's reading the tea leaves correctly.
Just to chirp in here for a moment, I want to come full circle to where we began. I'm a Reagan Republican who believes in American foreign policy promotes certain things, beginning with our values, of course, but in this case, defending the world's, helping defend the world's democracies who are under stress, whether it's Ukraine, Taiwan, or Israel. And Israel clearly is in a bad neighborhood. And so I think we should continue to support them. I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu did say that it's time to wean them off support. And look, I haven't lived in Israel, so I don't know what happened and what it felt like on October 7th. That was where, of course, Jews came after World War II because of what happened in Nazi Germany, and that the protective bubble that they thought Israel provided didn't. And I can't recall the numbers, but for some reason I want to say that the killing of 1,200 Israelis murdered would be the equivalent of like 35,000 Americans being murdered in one day.
Yes.
And so I think the impact on them as a people, on their confidence and everything else, is just until we put ourselves in their shoes. That said, none of that will be resolved until Iran is resolved, and maybe more importantly, the Palestinians. What's the future for them? And I think the challenge there is nobody can find a good negotiating partner. And in many cases, the Palestinian people are held captive also to Hamas. So I really feel for the innocent Palestinians who are really trapped between, these two parties who are trying to have different views on the conflict.
The American public attitude toward Israel is influenced largely along generational lines. For our generation, it was the creation of the Jewish state in 1948, and America was there, a big part of that. The efforts over the last 50 years at a peace agreement, Arafat and Rabin shaking hands, the White House, Camp David, so much of that was a hope of peace in the Middle East. We stood by Israel in that effort. For younger people, what defines their thought about, what defines their attitude about Israel is October 7th and the reaction to October 7th. And so, my kids' generation, your grandkids' generation, sees the state of Israel through that lens.
Okay, Jay, as Secretary of Homeland Security, you were responsible for enforcement of immigration. Did you see the problems at the border that developed during the Biden administration? And would you prefer that there be comprehensive immigration reform today?
Do we have another hour? Yes, I do. I believe that border security, securing the border, is a legitimate government objective. Strip away the racist attitude about great replacement and all that crap. It's a legitimate government objective. Most Americans want a secure border. If you go to any border town in Texas, that's 80% Mexican American. They want a secure border. They want control of the community. Along with that, most Americans, I'm convinced, want to see us treat in a humane and fair and compassionate fashion those who have been here for years, have not committed any crimes, and have become de facto Americans. The perfect example of that are the DACA recipients who came here as children. In 2012, we gave them what's referred as deferred action, where their deportations are deferred so long as they don't commit any crimes, and they get a work authorization. And the DACA class is a truly amazing group of young people. There are people in the nation's best law schools who are DACA recipients. There was an associate at my law firm who was a DACA recipient. And there's a lot of stuff in between about immigration policy. You know, people ask about immigration, it seems like an intractable issue. There are solutions. The bill that passed the Senate in 2013 was a comprehensive fix of our immigration system, failed in the House. The problem is that for too many politicians on the right and the left, fighting over immigration is good politics. They would rather have the issue to call the other side weak or evil than to actually fix the problem. There was an effort, I don't know, 2 years ago. Chris Murphy of Connecticut, James Lankford of Oklahoma, they came up with a good, comprehensive, bipartisan bill. And it failed because Trump didn't want it to succeed. He'd rather have the issue than to fix the problem. And that's the attitude of too many politicians now, which is why the problem persists. And, you know, Leon, I've heard you say that to fix some of our intractable problems in Washington, you have to have strong leadership. Somebody who's willing to suffer the political sacrifice to, you know, balance the budget, raise taxes, or fix our broken immigration system.
Okay, I want to go to, thank you. I want to go to that last question I'd like to ask all three of you, but before that, I can't resist. Secretary Esper, what do you think about Pete Hegseth's performance and behavior as Secretary of Defense? I would have gotten the same damn question. So.
Well, you can take it then. You know, one of the things I enjoyed in the job, it's a tough job. Secretary of Defense is a really tough job. They're all tough jobs. But what I enjoyed was being able to pick up the phone and call a predecessor from either party. And I did, often. You, Bob Gates, and Ash Carter, and a few others. And it really helps during tough times. And anyways, I had this conversation with Ash Carter once, and he said, look, I'll pick up the phone anytime you call. I'll drop whatever I'm doing and help you whatever way I can. And number two, you should know that I'm never going to talk about it publicly, and I'm never going to comment on you publicly, because that's kind of how we treat ourselves. So my approach has been, and during Lloyd Austin's 4 years in office, and now Hegseth is, the job's tough enough. I'm not going to sit out there and carp from the sidelines as a predecessor and say, you're doing this right or that wrong, or whatever the case may be. So I'll hold that to myself, and everybody else can they can make their own judgments about all that.
Well, Mark, I'll just say this. You would have been a hell of a better pick than Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, I usually throw this out at the end, and if you could keep your answers relatively brief, I'd appreciate it. You look at the situation in this country, you look at the situation with the war in Iran, and just internationally, the problems we're facing. When you look at this country, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our democracy? Jay?
Well, thank you for not asking me about Kristi Noem. So this is the easier question. I'm an optimist. I think it's in my DNA. I'll try to keep this brief. My grandfather was a sociologist in the 40s and 50s in the South, wrote a lot about civil rights. And if you were a black man in the South that wrote a lot about civil rights in the 40s and 50s, you were also a suspected communist. So my grandfather had to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee to deny in 1949 he was a communist. He had an FBI file. In the middle of all that, his son, my father, you'll love this, was drafted into the Army. He got out of Columbia College, he got his draft letter, and he had to go to the Army. Where did our government, our really intelligent government that always know what the other hand's doing, where did they put my father, the son of the suspected communist? In the Counterintelligence Corps. But a month before my grandfather died, he wrote this essay in the New York Times about what it's like living in the South. And
I need you to get to the punchline.
what's that?
We have a minute left.
A minute, okay. And he was an optimist. And so I'm an optimist.
Optimist. Okay. Wendy.
Put me in that column.
I had a long story to tell, but there are now 45 seconds left. I always quote my dear friend, business partner, former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who said, "I'm an optimist who worries a lot."
Okay. And finally,
Yeah,
Mark.
I'm going to take 45 seconds. Optimist, but here's why. Look, people always ask me, what's the greatest threat we face today? And folks think I'm going to say Russia or Iran or China and stuff like that, and it's not. It's extreme political partisanship in this country coming from both sides of the political aisle. That's what will kill us. And until we fix that, we can't fix immigration or the military, whatever the case may be. We have to fix that problem. So look, I wish there were younger people in the audience today, but those of you who are of our age will understand this. I remember the 70s. I remember long gas lines. I remember the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I remember Watergate. I remember all those things. We looked like we were in really, really bad shape there. And I said earlier, I'm a Reagan Republican. And why am I an optimist? Because I believe this country will produce great people. And I don't know who that next president is, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, male, female, whatever. But I think another Reagan-type person who will come and tell us about morning in America and lift this country up and bring us together is out there.
Okay.
And just be hopeful, because that person's coming.
Thank you. I'm an optimist because we have three people that make us optimistic about dealing with the challenges that we face in this country. If we can all pull together as a people, focus on our democracy, focus on our strengths, mark my words, we will not only survive, we will be strong, and we will be productive in the future. Thank you very much for being here tonight.